Lena had lived on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. Her small wooden cabin sat beside a dry creek where the wind always carried dust and whispers. She was an Apache girl with kind brown eyes and dark hair that fell over her shoulders. When she walked, she moved with a limp because her right leg had been badly hurt when she was a child. The people in town said she was lucky to even be alive, but they didn't treat her like someone worth saving. Most days Lena stayed alone. She weaved baskets from thin willow branches, sewed clothes for travelers, and sometimes carried them into town to trade for a few coins. When she came, people looked at her but said little. The shopkeeper pretended not to hear her when she asked for cloth. The doctor once said he had no time to waste on her leg. Even the preacher's wife smiled politely but walked away quickly as if being seen with her was wrong. Lena never answered back. She was quiet and gentle. When children laughed at her limp, she just smiled sadly and walked away. She spent her evenings by the fire, listening to the wind move through the old cottonwood trees. Sometimes she would talk to her father's picture, telling him about her day. He had been an Apache scout who once worked for the army, a brave man who had helped protect the town many years ago. But after he passed, people forgot what he did for them. They only remembered what he was. One hot afternoon, when the sky hung heavy and the dust clung to her skin, Lena went into town with her basket of sewing work. She wanted to sell enough to buy sugar and a little flour. The streets were crowded that day. Cowboys laughed near the saloon, wagons rolled slowly by, and the sound of a piano came from somewhere behind the buildings. She stopped outside the general store and waited for the owner to notice her. Two young ranch hands were sitting on the porch, leaning back in their chairs, watching her with smirks. One of them kicked the step and said something under his breath. The other laughed, pretending to limp like her. People nearby chuckled quietly but didn't say anything. Lena kept her eyes down and held her basket tighter. She had lived through worse stares, but that day something in her chest began to ache. She turned to leave. Then a shadow fell across the porch. It was a man in a brown coat with a silver badge pinned to it. He had gray in his hair and calm eyes that studied everything around him. His name was Sheriff Grant Holloway. He was new to town, just a few weeks in, and most people didn't know much about him. Some said he had lost his wife in a fire. Others said he had left another county after too many bad memories. Whatever the truth was, he carried himself with quiet strength. Grant stepped closer and looked at the ranch hands. His voice was low but firm. "That's enough," he said. "You're better men than that." The laughter stopped. The men muttered something, stood up, and walked away. The people watching from the street fell silent. No one had ever stood beside Lena before. She looked up at him with wide eyes, unsure if he would say something cruel too, but instead, he took the basket from her hands and helped her carry it inside the store. That small act changed everything. From that day, Grant began checking on her now and then. At first, it was simple things, fixing the latch on her door, chopping wood when he was passing by, or bringing her some coffee beans from town. Lena didn't understand why he cared, but he always said, "Everyone deserves a bit of kindness." She started to smile again, a soft smile that reached her eyes. He noticed the way she tried to hide her limp, and one morning he brought her a wooden cane he had carved himself. It was smooth, polished, and had a small star carved near the handle. She ran her fingers over the carving and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, saying only, "Helps with the walking, I reckon." The town began to notice. Some people said the sheriff had gone soft. Others said he should mind his own business. But Grant didn't care what they thought. He had seen too much loneliness in his life to ignore someone else's. One Sunday morning, when most people were at church, Grant rode out to her cabin again. He brought her a small radio someone had left behind at the jail, and he showed her how to tune it to the station that played old songs. The music filled the cabin softly, and for the first time in years, Lena laughed. She made him coffee and told him stories her father used to tell, stories about the stars and how they guided the Apache hunters at night. He listened closely, almost as if he needed those stories more than she did. There was something peaceful about her voice, something steady that made the silence between them feel safe. That summer, the air grew dry and the sky turned pale. The creek beside her house almost disappeared. Grant helped her dig a small well near the side of her yard. They worked together quietly, sweating under the sun, stopping only when the dirt turned to clay. She told him about her dreams of leaving town one day, of finding a place where no one cared about names or bloodlines. He smiled and said maybe such a place existed, but until then, she had someone watching over her here. Lena began to change slowly. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live again. She planted small flowers outside her cabin, painted her front door blue, and even went into town once a week without fear. People started greeting her with polite nods. They didn't say much, but their silence was softer than before. Still, not everyone liked what they saw. The same ranch hands who had mocked her once didn't forget the sheriff's warning. They whispered among themselves when they saw her in town, muttering that she was getting special treatment. Grant heard about it but didn't say anything. He just kept doing what he always did, his job and what he believed was right. One evening, Lena sat on her porch watching the sunset when Grant rode up slowly. He dismounted and handed her a paper bag filled with coffee, sugar, and a loaf of bread. "From the church," he said, though she suspected he bought it himself. She smiled and invited him to sit. They watched the sky turn red and gold together. The light caught her hair and he realized how young she still was. Despite the sadness she carried, she looked at him and said quietly, "Why do you help me, Sheriff? The others don't." He thought for a moment before answering. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said. "And I know what it's like when people stop seeing you." Lena looked away, her eyes shining in the fading light. She didn't speak again, but her heart felt lighter. That night, when he left, she stood at her door long after he disappeared down the road. Days passed peacefully after that, but whispers returned to town. Some said the sheriff spent too much time with her. Some said he had lost his sense of duty. But there were also a few who began to feel shame. They remembered the old scout who had once protected their fathers and grandfathers, and they wondered if maybe they had been wrong all these years. Lena didn't know about the talk. She just kept sewing, weaving, and waiting for the sound of the horse hooves that told her the sheriff was near. She had stopped counting days now. Late one afternoon, a strong wind began to blow, dark clouds forming over the hills. The smell of rain drifted through the air. She thought about closing her shutters, but before she could, she saw a group of men riding in the distance, their shapes blurred by the dust. Something in her chest tightened. She didn't know what they wanted, but the way they rode made her uneasy. She looked toward the town, hoping to see the sheriff's horse, but the horizon stayed empty. That evening, the storm began to roll in. The thunder echoed across the land, and the wind whistled through the cracks in her cabin walls. Lena sat near the fire, holding her father's picture close. She whispered softly, "I hope he comes." And far away in his small office near the saloon, Sheriff Grant Holloway sat by the window, watching the same storm build. He didn't know it yet, but the night ahead would test everything he believed in: the meaning of duty, the weight of kindness, and the courage of standing alone for what is right. The night grew darker as the wind howled across the open fields. Rain started to fall in thin lines, tapping softly on Lena's roof. Inside her cabin, the fire flickered weakly, and the small flame made the shadows dance on the walls. She sat near the window, holding a blanket close around her shoulders. Every sound outside made her heart beat faster. She kept hoping the sheriff would ride by, the way he always did, just to make sure everything was all right. At that same moment, Sheriff Grant Holloway sat alone in his office. The storm made the wooden walls creak, and the light from his lamp threw a warm circle across his desk. He looked at the clock, then at the badge lying beside his coffee cup. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't explain it, but a strange uneasiness filled his chest, as if the wind itself was whispering her name. He stood up, put on his coat, and stepped out into the rain. His horse waited patiently near the hitching post, shaking its mane as the water poured down. Grant mounted and rode into the night, following the familiar road that led to Lena's cabin by the creek. The storm grew stronger with every mile, lightning flashing far away in the hills, but he kept going. When he reached her home, he saw the small light still burning inside. He called her name softly, not wanting to startle her. The door opened, and there she stood, her face pale but relieved. She smiled faintly when she saw him and said she thought he might not come because of the storm. "I don't like leaving a friend alone on a night like this," he said kindly. He stepped inside, shaking the water from his coat. The fire was almost out, so he added wood and stirred it gently until the flames grew again. The warmth filled the small room. She poured him coffee in an old tin cup, and they sat together in silence for a while, listening to the rain beating against the windows. Outside, thunder rolled again, but inside it felt calm. She told him she had seen riders earlier that day, passing through the ridge. They hadn't stopped, but something about them had made her nervous. Grant nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I'll check it out in the morning," he said. "For now, you're safe. The storm will keep most folks home tonight." Lena looked at him quietly. There was something different in his eyes that evening, something softer, almost peaceful. She said she was thankful for all he had done. "You didn't have to help me," she whispered. "But you did. No one else ever did that before." He smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "Sometimes all a person needs is someone to stand beside them. That's all." The clock on the wall ticked slowly as the rain eased. The two of them sat there talking about small things, about the stars hidden behind the clouds, about the way the cottonwoods would bloom when spring came again. The room smelled of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, it didn't feel like two lonely people in a forgotten town. It felt like family. By dawn, the storm had passed. The air was clean and cool, and the sun rose behind the hills. Grant saddled his horse and told her he would check the ridge before heading back to town. She waved to him from the porch, her hair shining in the early light. For the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid. Later that morning, when he returned to town, people were already talking about him. They had seen his tracks heading toward the edge of town the night before. Some shook their heads, whispering that he had no reason to care for that Apache girl. Others said quietly that maybe the sheriff was showing them what real decency looked like. He didn't answer any of them. He just walked into the cafe, ordered black coffee, and stared out the window at the quiet street. Deep down, he knew that the town was beginning to change, not through speeches or laws, but through simple acts of kindness that couldn't be ignored. Over the next few weeks, he made sure Lena had everything she needed. He brought lumber to repair her roof, paint for her walls, and even helped her plant new flowers in front of her cabin. She laughed as they worked together, teasing him that he didn't know much about planting. He laughed back, saying he was better at chasing outlaws than weeds. Soon people began stopping by her place too. The preacher's wife came first, bringing a pie. Then the store owner sent supplies by mistake, which Lena knew was his quiet way of apologizing. The children who once teased her now brought her wildflowers and sat on her steps, listening to her tell stories about her father and the old days by the river. The sheriff often came by after sunset, sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee. Sometimes they didn't talk much. They just watched the horizon fade from gold to gray. She told him once that the sound of his horse meant safety to her. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the sky and said softly, "Then I guess I'll keep riding this way." As the weeks passed, a quiet friendship grew into something stronger, something neither of them spoke of, but both could feel. The people in town began to see them differently. The same men who once avoided her now tipped their hats. The women greeted her politely. Change had come slowly, but it had come. One afternoon, a group of travelers stopped in town. They asked for water and directions, and when they left, they spoke about the place as if it was kind, as if it was whole. The townspeople realized they liked hearing that. It made them proud in a new way, one that didn't come from land or money, but from decency. Not long after that, the town council called a meeting. They wanted to thank the sheriff for his service. When he entered the hall, the people stood quietly, not out of formality, but out of respect. The mayor spoke about how the sheriff had shown them the meaning of fairness and kindness. Then, to everyone's surprise, Lena stepped forward. She stood beside him with her cane, her head held high. Her voice trembled at first, but then it grew steady. She said she was thankful, not just to him, but to the whole town for finally remembering their humanity. There was silence after she spoke, and then someone started clapping. One by one, everyone joined in. Grant smiled slightly, a rare, quiet smile that reached his eyes. He didn't say much, he just nodded and looked at her with quiet pride. That evening, after the meeting ended, he walked her home. The stars were bright again, and the night felt peaceful. They talked about how far things had come, how much had changed. When they reached her cabin, she turned to him and said softly, "You changed everything." He shook his head. "No," he said. "You did. You kept your heart open when everyone else closed theirs. I just made sure people saw it." She smiled and looked at the sky. The stars reflected in her eyes. "My father used to say the stars listen when we speak truth," she whispered. "Maybe tonight they are listening to us." He looked up with her, then back down, his voice barely above a whisper. Then let them listen to peace. From that night on, the story spread. Travelers who passed through told others about the little town that had changed. Because one man stood by one girl, no one else wanted to help. They said the sheriff still rode the dusty roads at sunset, keeping watch over the people and the land. Lena's cabin became a place of comfort for everyone. Children brought her flowers, neighbors came for advice, and when the sheriff visited, the town stayed calm, knowing their peace was built on something honest and kind. Years later, people still spoke about them, the lonely sheriff and the disabled Apache girl who taught a town the meaning of compassion. They said the wind by the creek carried their laughter even after both were gone. And when the cottonwoods swayed, it sounded like a quiet promise that goodness always finds a way back home, and so, their story lived on, not in history books, but in hearts simple, gentle, and forever true.